The road to the asylum had not been driven in years, yet the dirt still carried the shallow grooves of old tires. Weeds split through the cracks in the broken pavement, curling upward as though they were reaching for something long since gone. On either side, the forest pressed inward, black-barked trees leaning unnaturally close, as if listening. The building rose from the end of the path like a carcass left too long in the sun. Its walls were gray and skeletal, windows shattered, rooflines sagging. Once, it had been a proud structure of brick and iron, a place where whispers of medicine and healing had echoed through wide hallways. Now, it was little more than a hollow shell. The gate still stood, iron bars twisted with rust, locked shut with a chain that had fused into itself. Yet the earth below the gate had given way, leaving a gap large enough to crawl beneath. The ground there was wet, as though something on the other side bled moisture into the soil. Inside the grounds, silence clung like fog. The grass was brittle and dry, yet slick beneath the shoes, as if water rose up from below. The air smelled faintly of iodine, though the building had been abandoned for decades. No birds lingered. No insects stirred. The main doors loomed open, one hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Beyond them, darkness pooled like ink, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The floor inside was lined with old tiles, cracked and stained, their patterns worn into obscurity. Hallways stretched left and right, forming a cross that seemed to extend endlessly. Dust lay thick over everything, yet in the dust were disturbances, lines, arcs, half-circles. Not footprints, not trails of animals, but marks drawn with care. Some formed symbols, others incomplete spirals, all pointed toward the center of the asylum. The center room had once been the reception hall. The counter remained, though warped with rot, and the walls were covered in peeling paint that hung in sheets. Behind the counter stood a doorway, sealed with boards nailed in crisscross patterns. Across the wood, something had been carved again and again, as though a hand could not stop repeating it. "Do not open." The boards were fresh compared to the rest of the building. Not new, but newer, years old, not decades. They carried the faint scent of smoke, as if they had once been scorched. And embedded in the wood, rusted deep, were nails bent from frantic hammering, driven with panic rather than precision. Beyond that door, faint and steady, came a sound, not loud but certain, a rhythm without origin, a tapping as though a fingernail touched gently against wood in an endless pattern. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. The sound carried through the hall, echoing off walls that should have muffled it. And though the air in the asylum remained perfectly still, the boards across the door shifted slightly inward, as if pushed from the other side. The tapping faded as the hall stretched into silence again, though its echo lingered in the bones. The asylum breathed in stillness, as though waiting. The corridor to the east wing yawned open, and the tiles beneath were discolored, coated in something darker than dust. A faint shine glistened where no light should reach. The east wing had been the ward for the unstable. The records said so, though the records had burned when the county offices caught fire. Only fragments survived, notes of locked doors, reinforced windows, and the cries of patients that carried through the walls deep into the night. Now the ward lay in ruins. Door after door lined the corridor, each one buckled, some split at the frame, others hanging open as if someone had clawed their way out. Inside, the rooms were small and windowless. Each held a cot with its mattress shredded, springs coiled like skeletal ribs. In one, the floor was littered with buttons, hundreds of them, scattered as if torn from clothing in a frenzy. In another, the walls were carved with fingernail marks, so deep the plaster crumbled into chalk. Halfway down the corridor, the air changed. The smell of rust thickened, mixed with the metallic bite of old water. The floor tiles here had buckled upward, cracked by something swelling beneath them. The walls were damp, glistening in the faint light that crept from the entrance. At the end of the corridor stood a door, still shut. Unlike the others, it was whole. A heavy steel door painted a pale green that had dulled to ash. Across its surface, chains wound in loops, hooked tight through metal rings embedded into the walls. The chains were newer than the asylum, bright, not yet flacking, pulled taut as if resisting pressure. And the door pulsed. Not outwardly, not with movement that could be measured, but with a sensation. Standing before it, the heart faltered, the breath shortened. The body swore the door shifted, subtly, as though something enormous breathed behind it. A faint vibration trembled through the chains, the sound of strain barely audible. On the floor before the door was a mark. A circle burned into the tile, blackened edges cracked into spiderweb patterns. Around it lay what remained of candles, melted stubs pooled into the grout. The wax was not old. Dust clung to it, yes, but only in a thin veil. This ritual had been made long after the asylum was abandoned. A draft slipped through the hall, though no windows opened to the outside. It carried a whisper, low and wet, not words but tones, a sound like someone trying to breathe through water. And then the door shifted. Not far, only an inch, but the chains rattled sharply. Something inside pressed against it, slow, deliberate. A sound followed, rising from the crack where steel met frame, a hiss that might have been air or might have been a voice with no language. The tapping returned, faint, steady, but it no longer came from the boarded door in the reception hall. Now it came from inside the east wing. The tapping grew louder as the corridor narrowed, then stopped altogether. Silence pressed in, heavy and absolute, leaving only the hollow rush of blood in the ears. The east wing opened into a chamber larger than the rest of the ruin, the chapel. Its ceiling arched high, though rot had collapsed parts of it, leaving beams exposed like ribs torn through flesh. Stained glass windows lined the walls, but their colors were muted under grime, fractured where stones had struck them long ago. Light leaked in pale and broken, stripping the floor in crooked patterns. The air was colder here, colder than any place yet within the asylum, as though the chapel itself had been hollowed into a cavity of ice. Benches lay splintered across the floor, smashed against the altar at the far end. The altar was bare, save for black scorch marks trailing upward in jagged strokes, as if fire had licked against it but failed to spread. Above the altar, the wall should have held a cross. Instead, only the outline remained, clean and sharp against the soot-darkened stone, as though the wood had been torn away violently. The floor was littered with debris, hymnals swollen with rot, rosaries snapped into fragments, beads scattered like teeth across the dust. But more unsettling than the ruin was the order within it. Amid the chaos, someone had carved a path. Benches pushed aside, debris swept in arcs, leaving a straight line from the door to the altar. The dust along the path was disturbed by footprints. They were not fresh. Dust had settled within them, but their shape lingered, bare feet wide with toes spread unnaturally apart as though they had pressed down hard enough to splay the bones. The trail led not only to the altar but beyond it, where a second door, nearly hidden in shadow, sat ajar. The tapping returned, faint but clearer now. It no longer echoed randomly. It carried rhythm, slow and deliberate like a metronome marking time. Each strike fell against the silence with surgical precision, impossibly steady. Something else stirred within the chapel. At first it seemed no more than the shifting of light through the windows, but then the shadows deepened. Along the ceiling beams in the corners where light could not reach, the blackness thickened until it was heavy, palpable, as if something leaned against the very walls to listen. The silence grew suffocating, stretching each second into minutes. Then the organ played. A single note, low, drawn out, vibrating through the air like the groan of a dying beast. The organ pipes along the wall were rusted, most crushed inward, keys shattered and useless. Yet the sound shuddered through them all the same. The note cut off abruptly. The tapping ceased, and the footprints in the dust seemed to multiply. Across the floor, along the aisles, circling the benches, pressing into the cleared path, the shapes appeared, one after another, as though invisible figures had stepped forward from the shadows. Bare, wide, splayed toes pressing deep into the dust, surrounding the altar, encircling the door behind it. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Worse because it felt like waiting. Beyond the chapel's hidden door, the east wing stretched into darkness like the throat of a cavern. The air grew denser there, as though the very dust refused to stir. Walls narrowed close, forcing passage through a crooked hall where ceiling plaster drooped in long strips. Each strip trembled faintly, swaying not with any breeze but as though something unseen had brushed past moments before. The tapping sound returned, but softer now, muffled, like knuckles dragging across wood from beneath the floor. Every step forward seemed to shift it farther away, yet closer at the same time, until it was impossible to tell whether it came from the walls, the ceiling, or inside the skull itself. Halfway down the corridor, the remains of iron doors appeared, each hanging crooked on their hinges. Their paint had blistered into bubbles, eaten all.